Other than understanding events, understanding what a user is one of the most important concepts to get your head around, I suppose, in GA4. And the reason that's important is because a lot of the data we look at is based on users. So when we look at things like user journeys, or even looking at attribution modeling and understanding the marketing mix or the number of sessions leading up to a conversion or an endpoint or revenue or something like that, we have to understand what is a user. And the first thing I always talk about when we talk about what are users in the context of Google Analytics is that they are not people. There's no such thing as people in data. And so we can't track how many people came to the website yesterday, for example. We can associate that to users and we can give that number back. If someone asks me how many people came to the app in the last 7 days, I will obviously go into Google Analytics 4 and get that number of users. But it's not people. It's the closest we can get to people. And the reason that it's not people is because the way that people are identified, and it's not based on fingerprints or hair color or eye color, things like that. The way that we work in Google Analytics is that, well, traditionally it's based on cookies, and that's obviously web specific, but traditionally web analytics was only websites. And the way cookies work is when someone visits the website for the first time, Google Analytics sets a first-party cookie, a GA-specific cookie, and then whenever they come back to the website, that cookie is still there. And that's what identifies someone as a returning user. And if they haven't been to the website before, there's no cookie, and so they have to create a cookie, and that's what we call a new user. But the thing about cookies is they're quite fragile, right? Cookies can be deleted. For example, I can go in and delete my cookies, in which case the next time I come back to the website, I'm a new user. I'm not a new user, I'm the same user or the same person. I'm not a new person, but I am a new user in the data. Another thing to consider is if you have a shared device. So if I, because cookies are saved at a browser level, if I share my device with my partner, we're both tracked as the same user in the data, but we're two obviously different people. The last thing to consider is around what if I don't consent for cookies and what happens there? There's also dependencies on things like technology, browser technology specifically. So for example, Safari deletes cookies after 7 days, specifically the Google Analytics cookie. Technically, it doesn't delete cookies after 7 days, it just sets a lifetime of the cookie to be 7 days. So if someone visits your website on a Safari browser today and comes back 8 days later, they will be seen as a new user because that cookie won't be there. And so there's lots of nuance here about cookies. And so in the traditional view of the world and the way that Universal Analytics works, for example, a cookie is a user is a cookie. And so there's a one-to-one relationship between cookies and users. And then when we go into the data, if they haven't consented for cookies, there's no data. So they're just not in the reports. And all of the stuff that we've just explained around some of the nuance around users and people are just ignored. And it's just telling you that many users have been to the website or the app in that many days. However, in Google Analytics 4, it's started to go beyond just looking at cookies, and it provides us a couple of different options. And this is in a feature called reporting identities. And so what I want to do now is just show you where we can access these reporting identities and what they mean. So if I go into the settings, the admin workspace, and scroll down and find reporting identity in the list. In there, there's a couple of options, but if I click show all, you'll see all three options. And we have blended, observed, and device-based. So starting at the bottom and working our way up, device-based is the kind of more traditional view of things, where it's a cookie is a user is a cookie. And now cookies don't exist in apps, but it's exactly the same kind of thing. It's a equivalent of a cookie. It's called an app instance ID, but it works fundamentally the same. Users have to consent, and then that data can be collected in a sense. But if they don't consent, then what? Or what about if a user has their cookies deleted or something like that? And so the next layer up, observed, if I expand this menu here, it contains 3 different ways of identifying users. And so now this is the first time that Google's starting to accommodate multiple different identity methods. It's a hierarchical list, so we start at the top there, we look at user ID. User ID is a way of, well, first of all, it's the golden source of truth. If you can provide GA4 the identity of the user, then they'll obviously take that above all of these other methods. But a user ID is only really applicable for users that have logged in or identified themselves in some way. So if you take something like an Amazon.com, right? Everyone's logged in there, like a Netflix or a Google or something like that. Everyone's always logged in, so why depend on flaky technology like cookies when you can, these users are identifying themselves every time they come to the website. So a user ID requires a bit of dev work if you've not done this before, but you tell Google Analytics who's who in terms of the data. If there's no user ID provided, then there's something called Google Signals. And Google Signals is Google's kind of big black box. It's trying to identify users based on what they know about people and their devices. And if there's no ability to connect the dots from Google's backend, then it falls down and defaults back to cookies and the app instance ID. So they call that the device ID. So you tell me, in a sense, you tell Google Analytics who they are. If not, Google will try and work it out. If not, we fall back and use these device IDs. However, that still leaves a gap of what happens if they don't consent, right? And so that's where blended comes in. So blended comes in and includes those three things before: user ID, Google Signals, and device ID. But now, what if they don't consent for the device ID? And this is where we fall down now into modeling. And this is a machine learning model that accounts for users and tries to learn and repopulate, in a sense, the data in your reports based on the missing bits that you're seeing. So those previous two identity methods, so the reporting identities of observed and device based, that is not going to account for any data if they don't consent. So blended blends together the observable data and the unobservable data, unobservable being the unconsented data. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail of that. That's a feature called behavioral modeling, and you need to use a feature called consent mode in the implementation. I've done a whole nother video on that, so I'll link off to that if you want to go into the detail there. But what you can do within Google Analytics 4 is you can change between these three different identity methods anytime, and it doesn't affect any historical or future data points. So this is a really interesting feature in GA4 where I can change what we mean by users, and it will have a knock-on effect and change all of my reports immediately. So I can go in here, I can, for example, use blended. I can click save, go run a report in Google Analytics, and then I can change my identity to device-based, for example, and then refresh that report and all the numbers will change. It's an interesting exercise to do, actually. You should try it yourself and see what change that makes, and quantify the differences. Another thing to consider is that this affects all data inside and outside of Google Analytics 4. So any reports that I'm running inside of Google Analytics 4, the reports workspace or the explorations workspace as well, but also if I'm using data via that API. So if I'm building dashboards in things like Looker Studio, Tableau, Power BI, those kind of things, it'll affect that data too. It has a big effect on all of the data. It's not something you should probably change day to day and flip-flop between different options, but it's an option that is given to us that we can change. As time goes forward and browser technologies become stricter and maybe consent is less freely given, we'll be relying a bit more on the blended approach just to account for the kind of the lack of observable data, and then relying more on the modeling side of things. But that's what those three things are. So when we say, what is a user in Google Analytics? The answer is it depends, which is an answer to a lot of things. But it depends on what we've selected here as the reporting identity. And you can go in and you can change that at any point without having any kind of detrimental or long-term effect on the data. Go in and change it a couple of times, refresh your report and see what happens. There are some limitations there that I'll link off to. For example, with the modeling side of things, there's thresholding. You need to have a substantial volume of data for the modeling to work. There might be some dev work required either through Google Tag Manager or through a developer to set up things like user ID. And you don't have to enable things like Google Signals. So this will be different for you. It will be different from another property as well. So I always have a look in here when I go into a GA property for the first time and just have a look and see, what do they mean by user? What are users in data? They're definitely not people, but they could be slightly different depending on the setting here. Anyway, I hope that's useful. There's a lot of information there, and I'll link off to all the resources as I suggested in the description of this video, but I hope you enjoyed watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.